hang there with me. We will get through this, I promise. So before we get into today's topic, I'd like to also briefly introduce She Geeks Out to all of you. We aim to foster diversity and inclusion in the workplace through events, networking, and education. And our mission is to educate, promote, and support diverse and inclusive companies as well as organizations. We aim to achieve this goal by taking a holistic approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. We create spaces for individuals, particularly tech and tech adjacent women, to network and connect with each other, as well as with companies who wish to hire them. And at the same time, we assist companies in their diversity and inclusion efforts by providing them with the knowledge, skills, and tools to shift and nurture a truly inclusive culture. We offer, among other things, community events, corporate training, and consulting services. So I'm going to briefly run through the agenda for today's session. So we're going to start out by defining diversity and inclusion. Then we're going to move into what is an unconscious bias. I'll provide some background research for additional context, and then we'll talk a little bit about unconscious bias in the workplace and how that comes up. And then finally, we'll do a wrap-up and Q&A at the end. So some dedicated time at the end for all of you to ask your questions, and feel free to chat them during the session as well. But just so you know, there will be time at the very end so that you can type your questions to me, and we'll get into all of that. So in order to accomplish all that we've set out for this hour, I'd like to propose the following. Be present, stay focused on the presentation. Staying on time is really more for me than for you. I will make sure we finish up on the hour. Adopt a learning mindset by being open to new ideas, vulnerable enough to ask any question, and supportive of each other as we all are learning new things here. And finally, get curious and ask questions. Between all of us, we have the experience and the expertise to help each other out. So I'd like to start off with a question for all of you. What does diversity and inclusion mean to you? Do you have any examples or definitions that come to mind? We won't take a ton of time here to collect answers, but if you do have some thoughts or answers, please feel free to start chatting them into the chat box, and I will let you know what our definitions of diversity and inclusion are. So this is literally the dictionary definition from Merriam-Webster. So they define diversity as having or being composed of differing elements or qualities. In the workplace, diversity refers to all of those unique differences and perspectives that we bring to work from our backgrounds and our experiences. Whereas inclusion is a state of being included, to make up a part of a whole or a group. And inclusion is really that platform that allows diversity to thrive. And you know that these concepts are present when everyone's ideas are heard and valued, and their unique differences and perspectives are invited and integrated in the business. So at She Geeks Out, we like to say that diversity is the what, or inclusion is the how. And another way of putting this would be saying that diversity is like a seed that gets nurtured by inclusion, which is the soil. For those of you who may be familiar with her, Vernee Myers, who is big in the field of diversity management, has said that diversity is being asked to the party, but inclusion is being invited to dance rather. And the final note I want to touch on is that we tend to talk mostly about diversity and inclusion, but there is also another component to it. So if we agree that diversity is about including all of the voices, we have to also note that inclusion is making sure that all those voices are heard equally, and that's where the equity piece of it comes into play. And we often tend to discuss diversity in stark numeric terms, like quotas or percentages of women or minorities in a company. But this definition not only fails to capture the dynamic and complex nature of diversity, but it has a tendency to drive resentment and backlash among majority groups. So when we talk about diversity today, what we're really talking about includes all of these elements that are listed here on the slide and more. And there are, different types of diversity. So there's inherent diversity, which are things like ethnicity, but then there's also acquired diversity, which are things like your socioeconomic status or your education status. Now, given what we just went through, why is inclusion part of the puzzle? Well, as the field of diversity management has evolved, we now focus on inclusion as the key to promoting diversity in the workplace. So it's one thing to have multiple diversity initiatives at your company. But if you're not also working and thinking about inclusion, then all of your diversity efforts are arguably much less valuable. So inclusion really matters because a breadth of ideas and perspectives can lead to more discussion, more debate, more innovation, essentially better products and solutions. And inclusion also challenges and stretches our own ways of thinking so we don't fall into things like groupthink. And when people feel like they can bring more of themselves to work and bring their authentic selves to the workplace, they're often much more engaged in what they're doing. At the end of the day, I always like to include this last point because we tend to get lost in the numbers and the business aspect of things like diversity, but really it's the right thing to do as a human being. A 2017 study from Deloitte looked at the power of inclusion. And so in this survey, they found that 80% of respondents reported that they would leave their current organization for a more inclusive one. And for millennials, inclusion played an even larger role in their retention, with over half of the millennials reporting that they would leave their current organization for one that was more inclusive. But what was even more interesting was that nearly a third of the respondents indicated that they had already left an organization for one that they thought was more inclusive. And so what we see is that in today's workforce, people are really looking for their companies and their organizations to go beyond addressing how diversity and inclusion look, but also how does it feel? And so this requires that we really have to go beyond the numbers and the metrics and look at things like engagement and interactions, which leads us to our biases. So if building out and supporting a more diverse and inclusive environment is our goal, we need to start by understanding how do we become more inclusive in our workplace. And something that can get in the way of this goal are our unconscious biases. So I have a quick poll, and hopefully this will come through for all of you. I'd like to just get a sense of what everyone's familiarity is with the term unconscious bias. So I've started the poll. It looks like it is working. So people are responding, and our 6 out of 6 say yes. Now people are still responding. I'll give another minute or so we have time for everyone to get their vote in. The options are yes, no, and I am, but I have no idea what it means. And don't worry, for all 3 buckets of responses, we will have something for all of you. Okay, so we got a couple more votes trickling in. And Rachel has informed me that she responded yes, which I'm really glad to hear. Because otherwise we would have some more work to do on our end. All right, looks like we got almost everyone voting. I'll give another 30 seconds or so to see if we have any last minute stragglers. And I'm not sure if you're able to vote on the phone, so if that's the case, then apologies. Just hold on to anything that might be top of mind, and you can vote mentally. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the voting. And it looks like we have about 90% of you have said yes. One person said no, and then a couple people said I am, but I have no idea what it means. Great. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. There we go. So, it sounds like most of us on the phone are pretty familiar with unconscious bias, which is great. Although I might want to question why you are here today. Hopefully we have some more information for you to expand a little bit beyond what you may already know. But the reason why I like to ask this question is because we all come to this with, maybe differing understandings or vocabulary, and hopefully what we have to share with you today will help expand a little bit. Whether you are not familiar at all, this will give you a little more familiarity. If you are already familiar with unconscious bias, then hopefully we'll teach you something new that you didn't know before. So for everyone's, just to understand a little bit of how we're going to get into this, I want to start off by just making sure we're all on the same page, so we all have the same language and vocabulary when we're thinking about these terms. So for those of you who have already heard some of this, hang in there. We will get to a more detailed dive into unconscious bias in just a moment. So really, we're the idea of unconscious, or you may also have heard it being referred to as implicit bias, and we tend to use these terms interchangeably. I personally like to call it unconscious bias, so that's what I will be using in today's session. But this unconscious bias comes from the seminal article, Implicit Social Cognition, Attitudes, Self-Esteem, and Stereotypes by researchers Greenwald and Banaji. And what they argued was that much of our social behavior is driven by learned stereotypes that operate automatically and therefore unconsciously when we interact with other people. And so is that we make these connections much more quickly between pairs of ideas that are already related in our minds than we do between pairs of ideas that are unfamiliar to us. And so these unconscious biases are almost like connections in our brains, like these unconscious lenses or pre-established filters through which we process information and make judgments. Now, we're constantly making decisions, otherwise we wouldn't be able to survive. We would just essentially shut down. And our minds automatically justify those decisions. And it's a really, really fast process. But the speed at which we make those decisions can actually blind us to the biases that underlie them, unless we stop and pause to consider what's happening behind the scenes, as it were. And this is particularly and especially important when the decision itself is important, as I would say most of our work decisions tend to be. And I want to note that these biases, given their very nature, can be quite incompatible with our core conscious values. But we say that we're reasonably ethical and unbiased, right? I mean, I would say that about myself, but there's two things to keep in mind here. First, it is that everybody has these unconscious biases, and they tend to come out and manifest themselves when we are busy, when we're multitasking, when we're stressed out. And again, that pretty much is a very accurate description of my daily work life, and I would hazard a guess that it probably is true for a lot of you on this session as well. So, you know, these biases are coming out all the time, but they're not permanent. And it's also not about whether the biases are good or bad. It really comes down to awareness of them. So we found it helpful to put some of this into context. Now, there's been a lot of research that has been done on this topic, and I'm going to actually pull out 4 studies that address conscious bias and how it plays out. And there's many more studies out there, and we'll provide some links to these 4 studies as well in case anyone wants to dig into it further after the session is over. So the first study is a pretty famous one. It's all about blind auditions for orchestras. So in the 1970s, roughly only 10% of orchestra members and symphony members were women, and conductors routinely made statements denigrating the technique of female musicians, calling them temperamental or unsuited to orchestras, and some refused to hire women altogether. And if you think about it, as a musician, really it shouldn't matter what you look like or what you wear or, you know, how tall or you know, short or thin you are. It should really come down to the music itself, right? And so this was kind of interesting that this gender being called out as something that affected the music. But around this time, many of the top orchestras started introducing what they called blind auditions, where they used actual physical screens to prevent the judges and the judging panel from seeing the candidates who were auditioning. And so 2 professors from Princeton and Harvard conducted a study that looked at the impact that those blind auditions had on hiring in this industry. And what ended up happening was that by the 1990s, the number of female musicians had increased to 35%. And so Golden and Rouse's study concluded that the blind audition increased the probability that a woman would advance from the preliminary rounds of auditioning by 50%. And the likelihood that they would ultimately be selected was increased several-fold. And if you think about it, it really takes away that visual aspect so that your biases that might be coming out if you were visually looking at someone are taken out. And that's one way that these people were mitigating and address potential impact that bias might have on their decision-making process. And some orchestras actually took it one step further, and in just having the screen, they also put down carpeting on the stage. And if you think about it, lots of people tend to wear high-heeled or different soled shoes, and so the carpet actually took away the possibility that a judging panel could try and identify who or what a person looked like or how they presented by even just hearing how their footsteps sounded on the stage. And so what we see today is that most orchestras are close to even 50% or even 60% women. And for any of you on the call who might be fans of the current TV show The Voice, that's another example of how they're implementing these kinds of strategies to help them with their decision-making process. So for anyone who is a Voice fan, or not a Voice fan, I should say, you've probably seen the visual of the judges in their high-backed chairs, and they only swing around after they listen to the person who's singing. And sometimes they get a real shock around because the person doesn't actually look like who they thought in their mind the voice belonged to. So in a second study, this addresses race in the labor market. So these researchers studied race by sending fictitious resumes to help wanted ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers. And the resumes were randomly assigned either white-sounding names like Emily or Greg, or more African-American sounding names like Lakeisha or Jamal, for example. And what they found was that resumes with white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. And this racial gap was uniform across occupation, across industry, and employer size. And we also see some other issues coming out today too, which relate to how race gets coded. And it doesn't have to just be our names. It could also be, for example, what extracurricular activities you put down on your resume. So if you were to put down something that said that you enjoyed polo or sailing versus, or you acted as a big brother or a big sister, you might have that lead to someone else's biases coding you a certain way. And again, not to make any assumptions for any of you, but I know if I were to read someone's resume and saw that they played polo, I instantly have an image in my head of who that person is and what they look like. So another example of that. Our third study looks at gender bias. In this study, researchers found that science faculty rated male applicants for a laboratory manager position as significantly more competent and hireable than identical female applicants. And so in this study, science faculty members were shown student applications that had been randomly assigned either a female or a male name. And the faculty participants not only rated the male applicants as more hireable, but they also selected a higher starting salary for them, and they were open to offering more career mentoring to the male applicants. And what I find really interesting about this particular study was that it didn't actually matter whether the faculty member themselves were male or female. And a quick note on the comic in this slide. This comic comes from the site XKCD. Has a lot of really great comics if anyone has a few hours to spare. But what it really touches on is how when a man does something wrong, it's his own individual mistake, but when a woman does something wrong, it can be taken as a confirmation that all women are inferior. All right, and our final study is one of my favorites. This is from Harvard, and this HBR article actually showed that when it to creating a diverse candidate pool, quantity actually can make a difference when it comes to gender and ethnicity. So in this study, the researchers had students evaluate candidate pools for a job where all the candidates had the same qualifications. And what they found was that when there was only one woman or one minority candidate in a candidate pool, the odds of being hired were statistically 0. However, when they created a new status quo by adding just one more, whether it was one more woman or one more minority candidate, the students actually would consider hiring a woman or minority candidate in those cases. And so a couple takeaways here. Having at least more than one diverse or underrepresented candidate in a hiring pool does make a difference. So for example, if you have only one woman in a finalist pool, it highlights that she is different from the norm. And unconsciously, deviating from the norm can be risky for decision makers. So this quote unquote get two in the pool effect is one step that you can take, a real step that you can take to overcome your unconscious biases and mitigate them when it comes to a hiring strategy. And so really, the final takeaway is it's better to have two candidates from an underrepresented group or none at all. So now we're going to see how this shared awareness and vocabulary can help us apply these concepts to the workplace. So it's not an exclusive list by any means, but we tend to see biases showing up in a few key areas. Interviewing and hiring for sure, our daily interactions, career development, so things like, who's getting promoted, and competence assessment, so things like performance reviews. Now, I'm going to go through 6 different types of unconscious biases and how they commonly come into play in the workplace. And I want to note really quickly that there are over 150 types of biases out there. We're not going to go into all 150 here today because we only have a certain amount of time. But we chose these 6 because they tend to come out and are pretty common when we are looking at a work environment. So this first one is availability bias. Availability bias is when we make decisions by overestimating the importance of information that is immediately available to us. So one example is when YouTube first launched their video app, roughly 5 to 10% of the videos would load upside down, and no one could figure out why. And so what happened was that the Google engineers had inadvertently designed the app for right-handed users, and they didn't even think about the fact that phones are usually rotated 180 degrees when they're held in a user's left hand. So that's an example of their availability bias coming into play because they're relying more on their own experience as a user being right-handed. And other examples could be when we're looking to, for example, bring someone into a decision, we might choose someone who's closer to us in an office or who's currently online, rather than thinking about who the best person or people would be to involve. So, if you were working remotely versus someone who's sitting in a cubicle, 1 or 2 cubes over, who's going to get thought of first? Or, if you have a report that was just handed to you, you use that report because it's physically in your hands and you have that information readily available to make decisions rather than doing more research and considering all of the information and the facts that are out there. All right, the second one I'd like to go through is confirmation bias. And this is when we create a hypothesis in our mind and we look for information to prove it to be true or confirm it, while we avoid or dismiss contradictory information. So, basically this is, you've already made a decision and now you're just looking to prove it and you're looking for proof. So for example, if you like someone as an individual, you might dismiss or not negative information or feedback about their work performance, and you might, oh, well, this is just this person's a really good worker or they're really great, so that information is irrelevant or inaccurate. Or if you consider a hiring example, let's say you have a candidate resume in front of you and you look at where that person went to college before the interview, you make a judgment about that, and then during the interview you would pay attention to things that would then confirm your judgment. So for example, let's say you have a resume of someone who is an Ivy League graduate, and so your judgment is that, oh, all Ivy League graduates are really smart. And so then during interview, there might be some pieces of information that perhaps could contradict that assessment. So maybe the applicant was late, or showed up and was dressed sloppily, or didn't have good answers to some of your questions, but you downplay those pieces of information in favor of others that would confirm your initial judgment. Anchoring bias is when we put too much value on or attention on the first piece of often arbitrary information that's offered to us. So we have this example, which I love sharing, and one of our facilitators used to work at Google as a recruiter, and she has shared this story with us, and it's always stuck in my head, so I will be sharing it with you today. So she had a candidate who came in for an interview who came in and they had vampire fangs. So their teeth had actually been filed down into vampire fangs. And to this day, she has no idea if this person was, qualified, educated, how well they did on the interview, what happened if they heard, because her whole attention was focused solely on that one piece of information. And so that's, maybe more of an extreme example, but that's always helped me remember anchoring bias. A less extreme example would be, let's say you have a woman showing up for a technical role, whether it's something in finance or engineering, and she's maybe wearing pink or has blonde hair, and you could assume that perhaps she's not as smart or she can't do the job as well. All right. Affinity bias is when we make decisions based on how we connect with others on personal levels. So, this is when you show preferences to candidates who are similar to yourself. When you say things like, oh, I breathe more easily when I'm around my own people. When you prefer to work or hang out with people who remind you of a younger version of yourself or who went to the same school or grew up in the same neighborhood. And so we see this happen all the time. And it's hard because at work, I talked earlier about wanting to bring your authentic self to work. And part of that is we want to like the people that we work with. And while that's not necessarily something that we can always have or that, is a guarantee in our workplace environments, what we like to say is that we like to be friends with the people that we work with. But we have to just be aware that this friendship or kinship can sometimes be a cover for affinity bias creeping in. And I'll give a quick example from my personal life. So we have a lovely co-op student who is working with us right now as an intern. And when we were going through her the whole process of interviewing, in her resume, she had noted that she enjoyed reading. And she not only noted that she enjoyed reading, but she also actually called out two of her favorite authors, who were Neil Gaiman and J.K. Rowling, who happened to be my and Rachel's favorite authors as well. And so instantly we were like, well, this person looks great. So her. And we had to actually stop and pause ourselves to say, okay, are we letting our own biases creep in? And how are we, giving into that or not? And so we actually had to put that piece of information away because we were like, well, it might end up being that we really connect with this student on a personal level, and we would love to chat with her about the books that she and we are reading, but we're actually looking for something that's a little bit more focused on work. And so we have to really go back to our scorecard and the metrics and things that we were looking for in an intern. And I will note that we ended up hiring this particular woman, not because of her reading preferences, but for other reasons. And it still happens where I think about this stuff all the time, and we had already discussed our affinity or potential affinity bias towards her. And even in the first week of her working, I literally turned to Rachel and said, Hannah really reminds me of a younger version of myself. And that was just such a wake up moment because it's so easy to fall into, because it's not that that's a bad thing, but we just have to keep in mind that these biases come out all the time. So that's one example of affinity bias. Other examples would be, hanging out with people like you, or, if you go out for a team meeting or a team lunch, you don't invite everyone because you don't necessarily feel like you're super friends with every other person on the team. So social situations tend to be ripe for having affinity bias. All right. Negativity bias. So this is my favorites just because I feel like this happens all the time as well. So this is when we have a tendency to react to bad things more quickly, more strongly, and persistently than to equivalent good things. So for example, it often takes at least 5 good or constructive actions to make up for the damage done by one critical descriptive act. And likewise, 1 point of negative feedback could linger in a person's mind much more than 5 of praise. So with this one, the way that I keep this one in mind with a workplace context is I'm sure that most of, if not all of us on this call, in this session, have had performance reviews of some sort. And if your performance reviews were anything like mine were, there was, all the good things that I accomplished and achieved, and the compliments and 360 pieces of feedback. And then there was always a section towards the end that was labeled something like needs improvement, or, basically the stuff that wasn't as good. And whenever I would receive a performance review, I would immediately skip past all the good stuff and hone in like a laser on the needs improvement section, because that was the thing that I wanted to look at, and those were the comments that would always stick out in my mind. So no matter how many good things I had listed in the review, if there was one negative piece or one critical piece in that section, it would just stick in my head, and it would be really, really hard to get out of it. And that's negativity bias. Not all of us are are blessed with having supportive managers or supportive teams. So sometimes this bias is really more upon us as individuals to help get out of that mindset. I know when I first started working in technology, I had a very supportive manager who saw that this negativity bias was creeping into sort of my head. And so he made a point of telling me, you need to not worry about that, because that's, yes, it's a little bit more critical, but it's really intended to help you get better, and you're already doing so well. So let's really focus on the things that you've done really well. And I don't want you to be so hard on yourself. And that's something that's really hard for us to take in and hear, because to be perfect, but perfection is not always easy or achievable. And so we have to allow ourselves that grace to allow for the fact that we will have things that maybe won't be all good, but we shouldn't let that take us over. All right. Now, the final one is beauty bias. And so this one is when we tend to think that the most beautiful or handsome individual, conventionally speaking, will be the most successful. So there's a couple different examples of this, but one example would be if you have a recently vacated role on your team, and let's say you're part of the hiring process. So you actually are looking to fill that role with someone who shares similar physical attributes to the person who was in that role previously. That usually is not something that comes out consciously, hence the fact that this is one of our unconscious biases. But it happens all the time, even if the role doesn't have, attributes that would be necessary to do the job well. Other examples would be selecting a candidate based on who you believe looks like the kind of person who should have the role. So, maybe you think, well, tall people would do better in this job. Or just because they're cute. Sometimes we may not always want to admit this, but let's say you're on a hiring panel and someone who you think is really attractive walks into the room. You might have this beauty bias just start to creep out a little bit without even realizing it, just because we respond to things like that. And so again, the point of this is that it's not that we have to eradicate this from the way that we operate or how we think about things, but it's about noticing it and being aware of how this plays into our decisions. By focusing on things like beauty or physical attributes, we might be overlooking qualified candidates who don't meet a standard level of attractiveness, or even your standards of attractiveness, or who could be different from the norm. And that's when we also have to be careful, because, if we're thinking about elements of diversity, ability, so sometimes that can play into things like beauty bias. Or someone has something that's physically not as common as most people, or who is in a wheelchair, or who is, much shorter or overweight than other people. So these are all ways that beauty bias might creep in. And we see this happening, rampantly. So if you take a look at the physical characteristics of people who are in top senior leadership positions, specifically calling out CEOs, you tend to see that A, most of them are men, B, most of them tend to be taller than average. And so this is also how we see beauty bias creeping into the process. So that is our sixth and final bias. And as I mentioned before, there are over 150. So these are just a handful of them. We actually keep a running library of different biases, and so there's a lot of research out there if you are curious and want to learn more. But as I noted earlier, biases I call out because they tend to come up quite a bit in the workplace. So, to recap, really, in order to address and mitigate some of these biases, in addition to education and introspection, it's really that awareness piece of it. So we want to make some of that unconscious more conscious, so that we can be better informed about ourselves and our viewpoint as we make decisions, and mitigate the fact that our unconscious biases might have on those processes. And so through this awareness, we can then take steps to, perhaps pause or interrupt that bias. And, what I also want to note is that it's easy to take bias out of a system. It's not always so easy to take bias out of an individual person. And so that's really why I like to say it's not about fixing ourselves, or, it's not about thinking about biases as good or bad. It's really just more about being aware that this is something that's happening. And so you don't have to spend 8 hours or a month or a week thinking about how bias comes up and really trying to fix yourself. It's really about just taking a quick second to just stop and say, oh, am I experiencing bias right now? What I've seen be really helpful with a hiring example is if you are on a hiring panel or if you work in recruiting or sourcing, you can actually print out a list of biases that either speak to you or that you are aware personally that come up sometimes, and just print out that list and have it easily available so that before you actually walk into a room to interview someone or before you sit down to review resumes, you can quickly glance at that list and then just have that in your mind so that if something does come up, as it came up when I was, reviewing resumes for my intern, you can take that moment and just be like, oh, actually, maybe my affinity bias is creeping in a little bit. So let me just pause that for a second and not look at someone's extracurricular activities. And let me look more at the projects that they worked on. So that's another way that we can stop and mitigate the bias and it creeps into our workplace interactions. So before we wrap up, I have some tips to give to all of you, but I want to just note that if you do have some questions, you can start typing them into the chat function now, and we'll have some time at the end, probably about like 10-15 minutes at the end, to go through the questions, have a Q&A session. So feel free to start adding that in now. But what I'd like to do is just leave you with a couple tips on how to kind of move on now that we have a little bit more understanding and education around unconscious bias and how it comes out in the workplace. So first, as I just said, really just as you stop and consider your biases. In other words, ask yourself, why are you thinking or why are you acting a certain way? Particularly in situations like reading resumes, crafting a job description, interviewing candidates for sure, providing feedback to an employee, or even just listening and observing in meetings, which I would say probably all of us are in meetings. So we may not all be actively engaged or involved with the hiring process, but we are all in meetings. And so biases can also come out in meetings as well. So just take a moment to think, is a bias creeping out in this meeting? Then, take a look at your processes, whether it's your onboarding, how you run team meetings, how you deliver feedback or offer performance reviews, and just maybe see how could you be more welcoming to your employees and maybe take out some of those biases there. I also like to say, really try and be an ally or a sponsor for others who may be part of an underrepresented group or organization or your company. You could also consider starting a diversity and inclusion affinity group or employee resource group at your company so that you have a more formal place to discuss issues as they arise and perhaps talk more about things like unconscious bias with others within your organization. And then, I like to say, really try to reject stereotyping because that's also such an easy way for us to give into our biases, and support having open and frank conversations, because a lot of it does come down to not only our internal introspection and awareness, but also that transparent communication. And communication is so key when we're talking about things like biases. So I want to just remind us all that we all have these unconscious biases present within us, but they're not fixed traits. They can change and they can shift. And the good news is that you can't unlearn this stuff. So now it's in your brain. But we can lessen the impact these biases have on the make with the education and the awareness, and hopefully neutralize them before they translate into behavior. And this process of introspection and self-discovery has many benefits, including identifying our own authentic values and developing more humility and compassion, which I argue is always a good thing. So I think we have time for the questions now. So let me just take a look at the chat box here. So Natalie asked, hi Natalie, do you have any tips for making unconscious bias training more successful in the workplace? Specifically, how do you help people that are skeptical to be more open to these concepts? Yeah, so what we've seen is that when it comes to trainings, particularly, it's not enough to just do a sort of a one and done training. And so a lot of times companies are looking at this as a fix, right? So they think, okay, if we are able to check something off a list, or if we can just throw money at a problem, then we'll fix it and we won't be biased anymore, or we'll be diverse, or whatever the problem is that they're trying to fix. And what we've seen just from personal experiences working in this field, and also what we know from research, is that that's not the way it works. We're never, as I mentioned before, we're never going to reach that level of perfection. It's never something that we'll actually be able to achieve. We can only move closer to that goalpost. And so when it comes to training, it's not going to be effective if you just come in once and then you give a training and then you go away or you end it there. What really is effective is doing things over time, because if you think about it too, as a company or an organization, it's not a fixed closed system. It's actually it's an organism, right? It's a living, breathing organism, and you're constantly having people leave, you're having people come in. People are learning more, having different experiences, and so you have to really respect that and address that. Seen to be effective is when you have, if you're going the training route, if you have trainings continually over time so that you're able to check in, make sure that you bring in new people as they come in, but also that you can shift and grow with the needs of the audience as they shift and grow. And so whether it's something that's done quarterly, twice a year, once a month, whatever works for your particular system and company, but really having that constant check-in so that you're able to deliver a training, get feedback, learn from that feedback, shift the work that you're doing, and then continually doing that as a process. And let me just take a look at, the second part of it, which was how do you help people that are skeptical? Yeah, so one thing that I like to say is that I personally do not advocate for mandatory trainings, because I think that that has a tendency to really drive that resentment piece of it. And if you have someone who's already a little bit skeptical, who's being forced into a training, then it's not going to end well, basically. And we've seen that come up a lot of times. So if anyone familiar with the tech industry, with James Damore, who is the male engineer at Google, forced to attend a diversity training, and he wrote the sort of infamous memo on how women are basically inferior to men. That's an extreme example. But again, what we've seen is that research has shown that even if you do something like an unconscious bias training with an audience that is kind of bought in already, that effect can actually spread beyond just the people who've taken those trainings, because those people are going back into their workforces and they're acting differently, they're sharing what they've learned. Even people who are skeptical or detractors can actually shift their behavior based on the behavior of people who are around them. So no mandatory trainings. Get the people who are on board to continue to be on board. And the other thing I like to note is that just really come to it from a place of curiosity. So if someone's skeptical, I like to say, well, why are you skeptical? And have an open conversation, because sometimes it brings up things that I didn't think about, or maybe it is a fair point actually. And so you can have that conversation, and it's not just about forcing your viewpoint on someone, it's really about having that open dialogue. Okay, so next question is, does SGO have experience in working with girls in technology? What are some creative ways to leverage implicit bias techniques with student youth population? Any success stories? Yeah, so we don't actually work directly with girls in tech, because most of our audience members for She Geeks Out specifically, on the community side, tends to be professional working women. So women ranging from 20 to women in their 50s and 60s. And on the corporate side, our clients tend to be more professional. So again, working people of all genders. But we do have a wonderful community partner who is a nonprofit based here in Boston called Moms as Mentors, and they do a lot of work in this area. And so again, what it comes down to, what I've seen at least from viewing what Moms Mentors does, is again, it comes down to this sort of double play of education and awareness. So really just talking about how this stuff comes out, and just making people aware, whether you're a younger girl or you're an older man, at any point along your personal journey and your identity groups, you really can learn and benefit from this stuff. So success stories, I don't have any off the top of my head, Kamaria, but I will ask our nonprofit partner, and we can share that with you if we have something to share in our follow-up email to all of you. Okay. So let me do the rest of the questions here. So someone noted the implicit bias test that you can take. Yeah, so the test is definitely, so Harvard has this website, which I think is called out in the chat function around the implicit bias test. And so I would definitely say take it with enough salt. So it's very interesting to take those tests, and they have tests on all different types of biases, and you can take it and see what your scores are, and you know, it will sort of tell you where your biases are and how it plays out. But I do want to note that more recently, there's been a little bit of research that's come out that has questioned some of those, the validity of those tests. And so I wouldn't take it as a set in stone. Like if you take one of those tests and it says that you're biased against a certain group, that's actually, you know, like set in stone, and that's the way it is. Just take it with a grain of salt. But we do see that more and more in the field of diversity management, it's starting to get questioned a little bit. So I would look at those tests more interest factor as opposed to actually rolling that out as something that you would, you know, ask your employees to take, for example. And someone asked about the copy of the slide. So we are recording right now, so you'll have a copy of the recording. Okay. Yeah, so Maya was asking that many of the trainings we hold for people play into accepting your unconscious biases. And so things like covering your tattoos, fitting in with the company's culture, and people with disabilities, especially hidden, have such a difficult time getting through the interview process in the first place. And so Maya's asking, how do you strike a balance between being the champion of exposing folks to their own unconscious biases and getting the people we serve jobs? Yes, definitely. So, you know, I think again, it really comes down to this idea, and this is why I like to talk a lot about inclusion as part of the puzzle, because especially when we think about businesses and companies, we tend to talk more about diversity. And diversity, you know, a lot of times we do tend to think more about the visible forms. And there's a lot of things, as you noted, Maya, that are invisible or maybe not as present or apparent. And whether it's something that's like a hidden disability or different learning styles or your socioeconomic background, or even the way that we present. So we know that, for example, people who are biracial or multiracial sometimes present as something that they're not. And so how does that, how they interact with people, especially if we're in that, you know, job interview or hiring process. So what I really like to talk about is the idea of inclusion. And so really spending the time to think about how are we creating, supporting, and growing an inclusive culture, because the inclusive culture would really have to, what that looks like is that someone coming into a company that has a more inclusive culture shouldn't have to cover their tattoos or fit in with the company's culture. And a lot of times what we see is that in the hiring process especially, or also when it comes to culture, we hear a lot of people talking about the idea of, and so what we see is that many times this phrase culture fit tends to be a cover-up for our biases. And so by saying culture fit, we're really saying, well, you know, let's say our affinity bias. Well, that person doesn't look like me. That person, I don't think I could hang out with that person. So they're not a good culture fit. And so again, because this tends to be something that is many times a little bit more unconscious, it's not that someone who uses that phrasing or that terminology is consciously trying to keep people out, but they're just they don't know any better. So they're, you know, when you say, oh, I just have a feeling, or I got a really good vibe from this person, that is a red flag for me. It's saying, well, that vibe is your bias coming out. And so instead of saying culture fit, what we like to say is replace that with culture add, or even better, values add. And so if you're looking to build out your culture, your organization, think about two things. First is, what skills do you need to grow and do better in your business? And then look for those skills, not how a person looks or you know, where they went to school or where they grew up, right? And then the second thing is, what values do you espouse as part of your company culture? And then look for people who share those values and can add to them, as opposing to looking for someone who can fit in with what you already have. Okay, and so yes, we can, the Girls Suck at Math cartoon, there is a a note and a link to it in the slide. So when you get the recording, you will be able to take a look at that. Oh, and Rachel shared that already. Great. Can we share some of the research that calls the IIT into question? Yes, we'll definitely see if we can send some stuff out in the follow-up email. All right, and so it looks like some people have had the audio cut out, so apologies. I am still talking here, just wrapping up. Let me type in for those of you in the chat. I'm going to just wrap up really quickly because it looks like we are out of audio, although some people are still hearing me. So again, you know what I like to say is technology never works when you want it to work, always is perfect when you don't care. So hold on 1 second for those of you who can hear me. I'm just going to type in so people who can't hear me are aware of what's happening. Okay. So some next steps that we would love for you to take is fill out our feedback survey, which we will be sending in a follow-up email. We do have for those of you who are familiar with and aware of what Slack is, we have a She Geeks Out diversity and inclusion Slack team, which is it's a private Slack team just for people who have taken our trainings. And so you can connect with each other as well and with other people who have gone through our training. And we share things like resources and people ask questions in there as well. We also have a diversity and inclusion newsletter that comes out every other week. And that is something that you can also sign up for. And we basically curate a list of relevant articles, content, topics, etc. And finally, our podcast will sometimes cover diversity issues as well. So thank you so much. We will follow up with a survey and an email, so take a look out for that. And it is just about 1 p.m., so thank you. And I'm going to also, for those of you who can still hear me, type all of that into the chat so that people are aware of what's going on. Thank you so much, and see you soon. Okay. And I will also note, and I'll type this as well, if anyone does have a question that do, please feel free to reach out to us. I'm happy to continue the conversation. So if for some reason you didn't feel like sharing it in the chat or the technology got you a little off, reach out to us and we will follow up with that. All right. And with that, I'm going to end and thank you all so much.